Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat has held a number of key senior positions during his decades of public service in 5 U.S. administrations, including Chief White House Domestic Policy Advisor to President Jimmy Carter from 1977 to 1981. He also served as a member of the White House staff for President Johnson. During the Clinton administration, Ambassador Eizenstat held several key positions, including U.S. Ambassador to the European Union. He also served as Special Representative of the President and Secretary of State on Holocaust-era issues and held similar roles during the Obama and Trump administrations and continues to do so in the Biden administration. Ambassador Eizenstat is the author of the book President Carter, The White House Years. Joining Ambassador Eizenstat today is Nadine Epstein, Editor-in-Chief and CEO of Moment Magazine and founder and Executive Director of the Center for Creative Change. Please welcome Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat and Nadine Epstein.
I'm so happy to have you today with us, Stu.
Thank you, Nadine. It's great to be with you and with Moment.
And I wanted to talk to you about your long relationship with Jimmy Carter. And I was wondering, when did you first meet him?
Met him in early 1970. I had come back from a year in the LBJ Johnson White House after Harvard Law School, and for 6 months working on the Hubert Humphrey presidential campaign against Richard Nixon. And when he lost, I came back to Atlanta, clerked for a federal judge, and then met Jimmy Carter. And interestingly, my first stop when I came back to Atlanta, which was my hometown, was not to Jimmy Carter. It was to former Governor Carl Sanders, who was a odds-on favorite to be the next governor. And I introduced myself as someone who had worked in the White House, a hometown boy. And he was mildly interested, but he was so much a front runner, he hardly paid attention. And then a high school friend, Henry Bauer Jr., said to me, "You need to see this young state senator who's running for governor again after an unsuccessful try in 1966, Jimmy Carter." And I said, "No, I've already committed to Carl Sanders." And he said, "Please just do me a favor, see him." And that one meeting was transformative for my life. I was very impressed with him. He had a real conviction as a Southern Georgian from the deepest part of the deep South of the state for urban issues, Nadine. He was a supporter of mass transit for Atlanta, which was a controversial position for someone from a rural area to take. He was for education reform. He was a civil rights supporter. And he had a sort of Kennedy-esque smile. And I told him, I said, gee, I frankly have already talked to Governor Sanders, and called me back for a second meeting, and that sealed the deal. And we've been close ever since for well over 50 years.
So you ended up working for him in the governor race. Was he a good governor?
Well, first, he was a great underdog in running against Carl Sanders, as he was an underdog in running for president. He was an excellent governor. He reorganized a state that had over 300 boards and agencies and trimmed it down to one with under 20. He was a tremendous environmental governor. He actually was one of the first and maybe only governors to that point, and I think since, who actually blocked a Corps of Engineers dam in his state. And that is rare because it comes free to the governor. It's all paid for by the Corps because of the environmental damage it would have done, called the Sproul Bluff Dam. And he made a very important statement when he was inaugurated as governor. And he said, and I quote, "The time for racial discrimination is over," end quote. That was really dramatic. He put Martin Luther King's painting up in the state capitol, which, by the way, the Ku Klux Klan ripped down at night. He had to put a second one up. So he was very courageous on civil rights, on the environment. He was a tremendous supporter of education. And as a result of Rosalynn, who had a passion for dealing with mental illness and bringing it into the light of day, not treating it as something to be put in the back room. He helped create a real mental health emphasis. They had a big immunization program, which he continued as First Lady in all 50 states. So he was an excellent governor, but under state law, could not succeed himself. So I had done a project for him in 1974 when he was appointed by Robert Strauss, the head of the Democratic National Committee, to head the Democratic Committee's congressional campaign. And he asked me if I would develop a series of policy papers critiquing the Nixon administration and giving Democratic candidates options to run on. And I still have those. There were 25 of them in defense and education. And a lot of the people who helped me ended up serving in the administration. But when we finished that project, I called him up and I said, Governor, let me take you to lunch at Underground Atlanta, a place called Dante's Under the Hatch, to celebrate the fact we've completed this. And it was only about 2 weeks before the election. So we were sitting at a booth with a state trooper guarding us. And I said, look, I've got a sort of wild idea. You can't succeed yourself. You've gotten some national exposure with your chairmanship and with these policy papers. Why don't you run for president? And if you win a few Southern primaries, like in North Carolina and Florida, you could be a vice presidential candidate. And with that toothy grin, he said, I have decided I'm going to run for president, but I am not going to be the vice president. I'm going to be the presidential candidate. Would you join my small campaign? And I said, that was the easiest deal you ever made. And so from that day, which was in 1974, I started organizing policy papers for him when he really was Jimmy Who. And he made his announcement in December of 1974 for the 1976 campaign. And I worked during that whole period, took a leave of absence from the law firm in 76, and was his policy director for the entire campaign, for the primary and for the general election. He beat people like Birch Bayh and Mo Udall and Scoop Jackson, who were much better known, and the rest is history.
So why do you think he won?
He won
What was it about him?
he won for a couple of reasons. First of all, any presidential candidate who wins has to capture, Nadine, the public mood at that time. And the public mood at that time, because of Watergate, because of all the abuses of the Nixon administration with the CIA, the FBI, and Watergate itself, was in a distinctly anti-Washington mood. And he came as a clean outsider, committed to ethics, to good government. And that struck a raw nerve in people. And he had a good record to run on. And of course, he ran on the traditional substantive issues, but I think it was really capturing the anti-Washington mood more than anything. And one of the keys to his winning the primary elections was Iowa, which was the caucus state, which is more and more in the news today. And he went literally to Iowa 100 times. He didn't have any money really to speak of to run on, so he stayed with supporters in their houses, and Iowans rewarded him by winning the Iowa caucus. Now, how did he win? So it's an interesting story. He got about 30% of the vote against Udall and Bayh and Jackson. The biggest percentage of the vote went to undecideds. But the headline was, Carter wins Iowa. That propelled him to New Hampshire for the first primary. And again, he had campaigned for months in Iowa, along with Rosalynn and along with his then 70-year-old mother, Miss Lillian. And one of his secret weapons was something called the Peanut Brigade. He was, of course, a peanut farmer. And someone named Dot Pageant, who is still very much alive, I saw her at Rosalynn's memorial service, and there was a big article about her in the Washington Post.
I read
And
it, yes.
Dot Pageant, and she organized the Peanut Brigade. These were Georgians who testified door to door for what Governor Carter had done in Georgia. So combined, he won the New Hampshire primary, and then the key primary, which really propelled him to the nomination, was defeating George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, in Florida by only about 3%. But that showed that a different kind of Southerner could win, someone who was committed to civil rights. And our message was to Southern people in Georgia, send a president, not a message. In other words, it was obvious that Wallace couldn't win. And then when we won in Florida, the next big test and the decisive test was Pennsylvania. This was the first real Northeastern industrial state. Could a peanut farmer from Georgia, a one-term governor, who, yes, had won the North Carolina and Florida primaries, but could he win in a big northern industrial state? And the win there really sealed the nomination, but not before a hiccup which almost derailed the campaign. And that is, we wanted to appeal to the working class ethnic vote in places like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And there were real ethnic neighborhoods. And he wanted to appeal to them, but he said something that was interpreted and not intended as racist by saying he wanted to keep the ethnic purity of those races, of those neighborhoods. And that had a devastating impact. I mean, even the black mayor of Atlanta recoiled. And the thing that saved him was that Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated at that time, but he was very close to Martin Luther King Sr., who we call Daddy King, and to Andy Young, who was the first black congressman from the Deep South since Reconstruction. And I called Andy and I said, Andy, you know that Jimmy Carter is anything but a racist. He's quite the contrary. He's pro-civil rights. We need to do something to counter this. And Andy got Daddy King together. We had a rally in the park in downtown Atlanta, and he embraced Jimmy Carter and said, I know Jimmy Carter. I trust Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is going to be great for African Americans or blacks. And that wiped away the whole problem. But for that, he would have been a footnote in history.
Wow. So he wins, and then you end up in the White House, and you're then you had really one major role the whole time. Tell us a little bit about it.
But the general election against Ford
Oh,
was very difficult, Nadine. We came out of the Democratic convention in New York in the summer of 1976 with almost a 30-point lead in the polls. And that evaporated to a win against Jerry Ford of 0.5%. Ford ran a very good campaign headed by Jim Baker. He ran as an incumbent president, the Rose Garden strategy. And I think the thing that ended up eking out a victory was one of the presidential debates, the second debate on foreign policy. And this should have been Jerry Ford's strong suit. You know, he had been a congressman for 25 years, a president for 2. And he was asked a question, I think it was by Max Frankel of the New York Times, at the debate, what do you think about the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe? And Ford said, in what was a huge slip, there's no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. And Carter latched onto that and said, you haven't been to Poland. You haven't been to the Czech Republic. Of course there's Soviet domination. And that really changed the dynamic of the race. Here was the supposedly most informed foreign policy person showing his naivete, and Carter latching onto that. And I think that's one of the turning points of reversing the momentum that Ford had built up.
So,
And we only won, Nadine, at 3 o'clock in the morning on election day by sweeping every southern state except Virginia. What Democrat has done that since? And Cliff Finch, the governor of Mississippi, calling us at 3 in the morning, saying, "You've just won Mississippi by 20,000 votes," and that gave us the electoral votes over 270 that we needed. But it was an extremely tense and tight election, and I think I aged 10 years during that one night of the election.
So I'm just curious, what was it like to work for Jimmy Carter?
So Jimmy Carter was an exacting disciplinarian. He had been, after all, in the nuclear navy of Admiral Rickover, where you spend literally 3 to 6 months underwater, where one mistake can mean the end of the submarine and the end of you. Rickover was himself an exacting boss, and Carter was as well. Now, when I say exacting, I mean two things. Number one, he insisted, to the critique of many, that the memoranda we sent him with pros and cons on issues had to have backup material. So he was fully informed of all the issues we knew about. And he was criticized for knowing too much detail. But that turned out to be critical in negotiating things like the Camp David Accords, where he knew more than anyone. So he demanded more and more information. But second, your memoranda had to be exact and precise. He even sent ones back with misspellings circled. So he demanded the same excellence, the same work ethic as he had. Now, there was a light side to that, because the White House job is unlike any other job anywhere in government. It's a 24/7 job where all the issues that can't be resolved elsewhere come together, where all the interest groups clash. It really is a 24/7 job. And he would wake up at 5 in the morning to start working. When he called a meeting at 9 a.m., if you were there at 9:01, you got a very harsh look. But he also had a warm heart and recognized the sacrifices that this kind of demanding job had on families. So he did something no president before or since has done. He allowed us to take our families and our kids to Camp David on weekends. He even asked my son, who was about 12 or 13 at the time, Jay, to jog with him. We would see movies, we would have popcorn, we would play tennis, we would go skeet shooting. And that was very restorative of our family life. But there was also an interesting anecdote in playing tennis. He was a ferocious tennis player, as he was very competitive at everything. And we played doubles. He was playing with his military aide, and we won the first set.
Who's we? You and your son?
No, it was one of the aides.
Okay.
And he said, "Okay, let's make it 2 out of 3." So we won the second one. And he said, "Okay, let's make it 3 out of 5." And it was only darkness that prevented us from continuing indefinitely. But it showed his competitive spirit.
So
now,
while
he was also, but let me give you a better picture of Jimmy Carter than I knew. He was as close to a Renaissance man as we've had in the presidency, maybe since Thomas Jefferson. Why do I say that? First, he was a great public servant. He served in the nuclear navy. He was the head of his county school board. He was a state senator, governor, and president. Second, he was a very accomplished painter. He was a preacher. He was a poet and author of over 20 books. He was a great and world-class fly fisherman. He was a great woodworker. In fact, the giant cross in the Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, at which he preached, was made by Jimmy Carter. He made excellent furniture, some of which is still in the Carter Center. So he was really a man for all seasons, in Thomas Wolfe's words, a complete person, and also a great, of course, humanitarian, building with Rosalynn over 43 homes for Habitat, starting the Carter Center, which was a real innovation at the time, Nadine. Presidents had had presidential libraries, but he went beyond that to create an active, engaged center. And President George W. Bush, President Clinton have followed that. He helped monitor over 100 democratic elections. He did conflict resolution in places like Bosnia and Haiti. He cured, along with a couple of pharmaceutical companies, 2 African diseases, guinea worm and river blindness. So he made this an active and engaged presidential center, taking advantage of his presidential credentials and continuing many of the things he had worked on in the White House. So he never stopped. He just kept going.
Well, let's go back to the White House a second. We're going to get back to his post-presidency, but you worked with him for a long time, and during your time, his time in the White House and your time in the White House, what was the most important thing that you think that you accomplished together?
I want to make a bold statement, and I'm not appointing him to be another face on Mount Rushmore, but he was, in my opinion, the most successful one-term president that we've had in our modern era. Now, I say that for the following reasons. His domestic accomplishments, which have been totally ignored, he got, according to independent surveys by the Miller Center at UVA, by National Journal, almost 70% of his legislation passed, just under the legendary LBJ. So all the ethics legislation post-Watergate that's in place today, lobbying reforms, disclosure, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, gift limitations, independent counsel to deal with wrongdoing, Inspector General, all of that was Jimmy Carter's. Second, the energy security we enjoy today from OPEC was built on the foundation of the 3 energy bills he passed that ended regulation of natural gas and oil to increase more domestic production, put conservation at the center, and started the whole renewable energy industry that we've now come to rely on more and more because of climate change. He put a solar panel on the White House roof. He had tax credits for solar and wind power. He really began, Nadine, the whole renewable energy industry. He and Mondale created the modern vice presidency. He was a great environmental president. His Alaska Lands Bill literally doubled the size of the whole national park system. He was a great education president, doubling funds for Head Start, creating the Department of Education, and increasing funds for the Pell Grants for low-income people. Here was a Southerner from the deepest part of the Deep South who was a great civil rights president, only next to LBJ. He supported affirmative action in universities, minority set-asides for minority contractors, and Nadine, he appointed more women, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and more Blacks and Hispanics to senior positions in the administration and to the courts than all 38 presidents before him put together. So in all of these ways, he was really a great domestic president. And if anything, that was outshined by what he did in foreign policy.
Well, before you go to foreign policy, can we just pause for 1 minute? We're going to get to foreign policy. let's talk a little bit about he also in the Jewish world that he was what did the brought about what is today the Holocaust Museum and Memorial. And I want you to tell us a little bit about how that came about. And you were at his side during this.
So in April of 1978, I wrote him a memorandum saying that we have no memorial to the Holocaust victims, although the U.S. Army helped liberate the camps and, of course, won World War II. And I think there should be a presidential commission headed by Elie Wiesel to recommend to us a memorial. He immediately agreed, and the question was, what would this commission, with Holocaust survivors and headed by Elie Wiesel, recommend? It could have been a statue, Nadine, but they recommended a living museum. And he agreed. I helped draft the legislation. We got the appropriations from Congress to buy the land for it. And he really is the father of the Holocaust Museum. He also was a great champion for Soviet Jewry. We doubled the number of Soviet Jews, then called refuseniks, who could emigrate from the Soviet Union from 25 to 50. He's saved by Natan Sharansky, now Anatoly Sharansky's, or then Anatoly, now Natan, by his own admission in his memoirs, by saying that he was not a Soviet spy, as they had alleged, for the United States, as they had alleged. And we met with Avital, his wife, several times. And of course, the Camp David Accords and the Middle East peace process with Egypt took away Israel's most feared Arab enemy. And that peace lasts to this very day.
We're going to come back. We're going to come back to that in a minute because it's really important. So Jimmy Carter is a very religious man, and I was wondering what was in your experience, what was his attitude towards Judaism?
So this is very interesting. He was very religious, very pious, was a preacher. He and Rosalynn would read the Bible, oftentimes, by the way, in Spanish, before they went to sleep every night. He went every Sunday to church that he was in town for. And yet, he had a different kind of religion than the evangelical political religion that we see today in much of the South. In the following way, his Baptist religion was built on Christ's Sermon on the Mount, the social gospel. That suffused him. That's what created his championing of civil rights and tolerance and human rights in foreign policy. And that branch of the Baptist religion was taken over by Jerry Falwell while he was president. And Falwell actually said of Carter, he's not a real Baptist. He's got homosexuals on his staff. And so being a Baptist, he never was judgmental about me as a Jew. In fact, he had appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Steve Breyer as a judge. He had an uncle who was Jewish. And one of the most memorable things I have at the very table I'm speaking at now is on Passover, immediately after the Camp David Accords and the treaty. So imagine we now have a treaty between Egypt and Israel, and we're reading in the Haggadah about Jews coming out of Egypt. He stayed through the whole Seder.
Let's pause a second. Let's tell everybody about, you invited him to come, or did he invite himself? You were having a Seder. It's Passover. You were having a Seder at your home in Chevy Chase, right? And
that's right. And
tell us a little bit about how this happened.
So Fran and I got the, I would say, sort of wild hair. Why not invite the president and the first lady to join us for our family Seder? And my mother was there. You know, my father was there. We had it's a very traditional Seder. We don't miss anything. My in-laws were there, my sister-in-law, Fran, and the boys who were very young at that time. And we invited him, and he said, of course, I would love to come. A number of humorous incidents about that. One was we came to the point in the Seder where the host, me, opens the door for the prophet Elijah, metaphorically, to come in. And as I got up to do that, the Secret Service jumped me and said, no, we've secured the house. You can't open the door with the president here. And I explained that I had to do it. And Jimmy Carter was laughing hilariously. And I negotiated the following, that while we couldn't open the front door because it abutted the street, we could open the back door where there was no street and just a patio. So it's the only time that Elijah has come through the back door. And he stayed for the entire Seder. And it was so meaningful to be talking about the Jews being liberated from Egyptian slavery. And here at Camp David and at the treaty just a few weeks before, he had negotiated the first peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. I mean, it was really history coming full circle and incredibly meaningful for us.
As far as you know, was that the first time a president who was in the White House actually attended a Seder? I know everyone talks about under the Obama administration, there were Seders in the White House. This is how,
he followed us. This was the first time he did it with the staff at home. He set the standard for presidents doing this. Just, by the way, and this is another first, just as he was the first to allow and to attend a Hanukkah menorah lighting, in this case in Lafayette Park, just before his state dinner with Margaret Thatcher. And Rabbi Shinto from the Chabad, my wife Fran, my two boys, Jay and Brian, and the president lit the Hanukkah menorah. I have a picture of it in my den. And this was the first president to have a Hanukkah menorah lighting. And that was also very meaningful. It's been done now ever since, now in the ellipse by the Chabad. And President Carter started that, just as he started the museum, just as he was the first to do this Passover Seder, just as he was the first to reach peace between Israel and its Arab enemies. All of this is largely forgotten by the Jewish community, I think in part because of the unfortunate book that he wrote called Apartheid or Peace, but it was really a book urging a two-state solution. I think the title was wrong, but that's overshadowed all of the other things he did for the Jewish community, championing Soviet Jewry and the like.
Well, we're going to come back to that in a minute. But let me just take you someplace a little different. So Rosalynn Carter just passed away really last week, and I know you went to her memorial service, and I'm wondering when did you first meet her?
Well, I first met her. First met Rosalynn Carter in the 1970 campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 66 campaign, Nadine, she was so painfully shy, she literally didn't make one public speech. And even in 1970, when I had first gotten to know her, she hated public speaking. She was very uncomfortable with it. And what I saw over the years and into the White House years is a flower bloom. She became a full political and policy partner for the president. She had so many firsts as First Lady, the first First Lady to have her own office and staff congressionally funded in the White House, in the East Wing. The first First Lady to testify on her own legislation, the Mental Health Systems Act of 1980, to lobby it and to get it passed in the Congress. The first First Lady to have an immunization program all 50 states. The first lady to attend cabinet meetings. Why? Because when she was out speaking, she wanted to be knowledgeable about the issues. She didn't just want to engage in tea parties. She set a new standard. She's the one that really helped pick out so many of these women who, as I mentioned, it was more women, twice as many women as had ever been appointed by all 38 predecessors as federal judges and as senior officials in administration. She helped pick them out. She was the first lady to have substantive trips abroad. In the first 5 months of her presidency, she went to Latin America, not to meet with first ladies, but to meet with the heads of state, the military dictators, to tell them about the president's new human rights policy, and that if they didn't democratize, they didn't treat human rights seriously, that we were going to reduce their arms sales, and which was very important to them. She went to Thailand and championed the cause successfully of the Cambodian refugees who had come there. So she was very engaged also in foreign policy. She was a great political advisor. In fact, she was more of a politician than he was. She said, for example, on the Panama Canal Treaty, Jimmy, why don't you wait till the second term? Every president since LBJ has tried to take this on, and no one has been willing to really take it to fruition. It's so politically charged. Carter said, well, suppose there is no second term. And he overrode her advice. So she was a really very good political advisor and policy advisor and substantive first lady of the very first order.
You spent a lot of time with them together, and I'm wondering, just, people talk about this, but in your opinion, what were they like as a couple?
I went down to their 75th wedding anniversary in Plains. 75 years, and at her death, 77 years. They were utterly devoted to each other, held hands when they walked. You could see the love between them. I saw it at Camp David. I saw it at so many White House functions. I saw it at so many White House meetings. The affection, the chemistry was a beautiful thing to watch between the two of them. They had one major argument, and that is she had grown up in Plains too. And when he was in the Navy, he was posted all around the country, and they went to posts as far away as Hawaii. And this was liberating for her, Nadine, to get out of tiny Plains with a population of 600 people and to see the world as the wife of an officer of the nuclear Navy. When his father, James Earl Carter III, became very sick with cancer, he decided to leave the Navy and go back to Plains to salvage the business which was falling into bankruptcy. She desperately didn't want to go back. She cried on the way back. She didn't talk to him on the way back. It was a real crisis. But when she got back, she became a full partner in the business, in the sense that when he started his political activities and running for state senate, running for state senate in the Plains area, she really took over the business. She was a very good business person. So she got over that problem, made herself a real citizen of Plains, a beloved citizen. But it was a very tough transition back for her.
Well, let's now switch over to Camp David a little bit here. And I'm just, why did he care so much about peace in the Middle East? Why was this so high on his list?
He had gone to the Middle East, to Israel, for the first time at the invitation of Golda Meir, who was the prime minister, and Yitzhak Rabin, who was then Israeli ambassador to Washington. And he was deeply impressed by Israel, by the Jewish state. It comported with his religious beliefs that Jews should have a state of their own. He believed deeply in trying to bring peace to the Holy Land. which was so torn by war. So it was a combination of a sort of religious and ethnic identity, with Jews having their own piece of land for a homeland and for a state. But it was also part of a strategic balance. Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, had thrown out his Soviet advisors only 4 years before Jimmy Carter's inauguration. So bringing peace to the Middle East was part of putting a stamp of the United States into this troubled region during the Cold War. So it was a combination of wanting to bring peace to the Holy Land from a personal perspective, but from a strategic perspective, it was trying to make sure that the Soviet Union had much less influence in the region, and the United States' influence would be much greater.
So he had a real understanding of all these international forces, and this mattered to him. Well, and what was it? You know, many people tried to create peace before him and forge peace before him in the Middle East. And what was it about him, and many people have tried since, that helped push two enemies, really, Israel and Egypt, and their leaders to peace? What was there something unique about
Well,
Jimmy Carter?
It needs to be said that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, his Secretary of State, helped lay the foundation by the two disengagement agreements in 73 and 74, 75 that separated the forces. Now, there was not peace. There was an effective ceasefire and a partial withdrawal. And President Carter realized that that sort of step-by-step process had reached its apex, and that Israel was not going to withdraw from any more territory in Sinai without getting full peace. And he developed a personal relationship with Sadat, which was quite beautiful to behold. Sadat made his historic trip to Jerusalem. But interestingly, he did it because, in a way, of a mistake that Jimmy Carter made in the Middle East. He started his presidency by seeking a comprehensive peace and trying to revive the Geneva Conference that had been unsuccessful under Kissinger, and to solve all the problems with Syria, with Jordan, with Egypt, all together with a summit that would have 22 Arab countries. And the Israelis balked at this. He had to back off. And I'm convinced to this day that one of the reasons that Sadat made his historic trip to Jerusalem was realizing that if he had to rely on a Geneva conference, that if he had to give Hafez al-Assad of Syria a veto over any peace agreement, he'd never get the Egyptian Sinai back. And so the president shifted gears, went from a comprehensive settlement to a bilateral agreement with Egypt and Israel, which was more digestible. Israel didn't have a sort of historic relationship to Sinai in the way it did to the West Bank. It still was exceedingly difficult. And here you get to what was he was criticized for somehow asking for too much information, for mastering too many details. This was critical at Camp David, as it was in so many other areas, and let me show you how. He invited, after Sadat's trip to Jerusalem, there were a number of meetings between Israel and Egypt, because the Camp David Accords were a framework for peace, Nadine. They weren't a binding treaty. And he tried to create a binding treaty between the two of them. And they could not agree themselves. And so he took a real risk, over the objection of almost every one of his advisors, to invite Begin and Sadat and their team to the presidential retreat at Camp David, by the way, at Rosalynn's suggestion, to have this rustic retreat separated from the press and isolated. And he was such a knowledgeable interlocutor, mediator. And he did so many personal touches. So personal touch number one was having a Shabbat dinner, fully kosher, at Camp David. They koshered the kitchen, and he stayed for the full Shabbat dinner. And Begin was very touched by that. Then the next Sunday, 2 days later, he took Sadat and Begin to Gettysburg, to the Gettysburg battlefield, to symbolically say enough wars. And Sadat, who had been a general and did some of his training in the United States, knew all the mistakes that the Confederates made at Gettysburg, which was a little embarrassing, like Pickett's last charge, which was a little embarrassing for Carter as a Southerner. But for Begin, who was not a military man, he was a student of Abraham Lincoln. And on the spot, Nadine, with no notes, he gave the Gettysburg Address. So this helped break the ice. Notwithstanding that, Jimmy Carter negotiated and wrote personally, I'm saying personally, 22 peace agreements in that 13-day period, and went from one cabin to another, Sadat's to Begin's. When he couldn't deal with Begin successfully, he went to Diane, the foreign minister, and Asa Weitzman, the defense minister, in particular, the Aharon Barak, who's still very much alive, became the Supreme Court justice. He was the legal advisor, and he personally negotiated Camp David. But here again is where knowledge and personal involvement come into effect. We were now at the 13th and last day. Carter had to get back. He couldn't stay forever away from the Oval Office. And Begin came to see him and said, "Mr. President, I'm sorry, I can't make any more compromises. Please get me a limousine to take me to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane waiting. I'm sorry, we're close, but it didn't work." And Carter could see Sadat's whole historic mission collapsing and going home with empty-handed and possibly facing assassination, which happened later. He could see his whole presidency going down the drain, having put so much energy into it. And here again, doing your homework and personal connections make a difference in diplomacy. He knew from the CIA profile of Begin that he loved his 8 grandchildren. He got Susan Clow, his personal secretary, to give him the names of those 8 grandchildren. And then he made 8 copies of the original photos that were made when Begin and Sadat came to Camp David, the 3 of them, and wrote personally to each of the 8 grandchildren with hope for peace, Jimmy Carter, and then delivered it to Begin's cabin at Camp David as he had his luggage literally waiting to leave. And he could see Begin's eyes water and his lips quiver as he read the names of each of his grandchildren. He put his suitcase down and he said, "Mr. President, I'll make one last try." And that's how Camp David was finally consummated.
That's an amazing story, Stu. Wow.
And the
yet,
story actually
yeah.
of the treaty is equally interesting, or at least very interesting. The Camp David Accords called for a treaty within 3 months. Well, 3 months went by, 4 months went by, 5 months went by. We're into 6 months, no treaty. And I'm telling you, not exaggerating, over the objection of every single advisor, his Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor, his political advisor, he decided to go to Israel and Egypt and engage in the kind of shuttle diplomacy that Kissinger had done as President of the United States. And we said to him, "Look, if this fails, it's going to be catastrophic for you." And he said, "I've invested so much, I've got to try to make it work." So for 3.5 days, night and day, he met with Sadat in Cairo and in Alexandria. He met with Begin in Jerusalem. He met with the cabinet. And we were close, but not there. Carter gave up. He was staying at the King David Hotel in the presidential suite. He had changed into his blue jeans and relaxed clothes for the trip home. Air Force One was fully secured and fueled. Most of the staff that had come with him had gone down to Ben Gurion Airport, and a few staff are left. And he says, when Begin calls up suddenly and says, "I'd like to see the president before he leaves," we all thought, well, this is just, to say thanks, but no thanks. I'm sorry this happened, but thanks for coming. So Carter redresses himself, puts a coat and tie on. Begin was very formal. And he says, "Boys, entertain the prime minister while I get redressed." And Begin says, "Now, boys, this hotel, the King David, is very famous and historic, and he says, but not for the reasons you think. I blew this hotel up when I was head of the air gun and the British were here. But don't worry, I'm not going to blow it up while the president's here." He goes up to the presidential suite. That's where the deal was reached for the treaty. They come down on the elevator, and the elevator of the historic King David Hotel breaks between the first floor and the lobby. The Secret Service has to pull the prime minister and the president out butt first, and I call it the breech berth of the Egyptian-Israel treaty.
Wait, the elevator got stuck?
It got stuck, and they had to be pulled out butt first, and I call it the breech berth of the treaty.
Oh my, I never heard that story. Wow, that's amazing. So here is a president who achieved so much that was important to American Jews, yet he was judged so harshly. And, while he was president even. So tell us a little bit about that. Why?
Yes. It's such, I would say, using the vernacular of Shonda, that a president who reached the first treaty between Egypt and Israel, created the Holocaust Museum, championed Soviet Jewry, lit the first Hanukkah menorah, would get fewer Jewish votes, only a little over 40%, than any Democratic candidate in modern times. And I think it was because this was before the Apartheid and Peace book. That was years later. That was 30 years later. It was because, Nadine, to reach these historic accords, he had to push Begin very hard. He never threatened to cut funds off. He never threatened to have a reassessment, as President Bush later did, but he pushed very hard. And he had to push very hard. Begin was a tough customer. He had trouble even accepting UN Resolution 242. But I think it's that pressure on Israel, and of course it had to be on Egypt as well, but that pressure on Israel was one of the reasons. And the second reason, and this is totally forgotten, we had gotten 70% of the Jewish vote in the Illinois primary just 2 weeks before the New York primary. And then something happened, which I've written up in my book, President Carter, the White House Years, which really flipped and I think was the ultimate cause of his percentage going from 70% down to 40%. In fact, it led to Jewish workers in our headquarters in New York leaving. And that is the following. At Camp David, Carter promised that he would not support any UN resolution that mentioned Jerusalem or criticized Israeli control of Jerusalem. There was a UN resolution in 1980, introduced interestingly by the Egyptians. And Carter was of the opinion that he had instructed his UN ambassador and Secretary of State, Vance, to veto, or at least not to support, to abstain from that resolution. Through a miscommunication, the resolution was supported by our UN ambassador, Donald McHenry. That caused a huge flap, and it led to Kennedy winning New York. I know from interviewing his staff that Kennedy was already, if he lost New York, and we had a 20-point lead in the polls before this fiasco, was going to make a concession speech in Boston. He had already reserved the hotel room. Instead, Kennedy won New York because the Jews switched from Carter to Kennedy over that resolution. It was a disaster of miscommunications. Carter apologized. He said it was a mistake. They had violated his own commitment, but it was just devastating.
So here we are so many decades later, and is it time for the American Jewish community to forgive Jimmy Carter and reconsider his legacy?
Yes, I would not use the term forgive. I would use the term recognize the major contributions he made to Jewish causes, and not the least of which, by the way, I've mentioned all the others, was taking championing human rights in the Soviet Union, championing Soviet Jewry, but also when the Afghan invasion by the Soviet Union occurred, even his conservative critics applauded his increasing defense spending by 5%. He put in place all the missile systems and cruise missiles and MX missiles and stealth bomber, all the things that Reagan later implemented that Carter doesn't get any credit for starting. And by taking such a tough position in Afghanistan, the Olympic boycott, which we did not do in 1936 in the Berlin Olympics, the grain embargo, supporting the Mujahideen against them, this really weakened the Soviet Union, weakened the Soviet Union's anti-Jewish, anti-Soviet Jewish activities, and ultimately led to the downfall of the Soviet Union and the release of Soviet Jews. So this is fairly recognized. It's time for the American Jewish community. Yes, the apartheid book was a mistake. He admitted it was a mistake. He was simply really trying to reinforce the importance of a two-state solution. But as President of the United States, he did wonders for American foreign policy and for the American Jewish community and for Israel. And he should be recognized for that.
So on his watch, the revolution occurred, Islamic revolution occurred in Iran, and the hostages were taken. And I think my impression, this has a huge, it was one of those impossible situations that presidents face. Do you feel like he was judged harshly for his handling of that?
With all the accomplishments that I've mentioned, both domestic and foreign, why did we lose so convincingly in a landslide to Ronald Reagan? It's what I call the three I's. Inflation, substantially, by the way, we inherited high inflation from Nixon and Ford, but it got more elevated, substantially because of the oil crisis from the Iranian Revolution. 5 million barrels of Iranian oil were taken off the market. Oil doubled in price. We had gasoline lines. The second I is inflation itself, double-digit inflation. And here he deserves credit for appointing Paul Volcker to tackle inflation, knowing that Volcker was going to choke inflation the hard way by raising interest rates. And Carter we told him, if you appoint him, this can risk your reelection. And he said, I don't want to be remembered for passing on high inflation. Reagan became the beneficiary of lower inflation, not him. And the third was Iran. Now, we did not lose Iran. The Shah lost Iran because he had lost public support. He had alienated all levels of society. We tried to save the Shah. It's a misnomer, and Iranian Jews in the United States who I've become very friendly with because I was able to get, and this is another thing we didn't talk about. Jimmy Carter got 50,000 Iranian Jews out of Iran.
Yes.
Jimmy Carter did by a special visa program I helped create with them. But he's blamed for somehow losing Iran and having the Shah leave Iran. No, we told the Shah, we'll support you militarily. The Shah said when the demonstrations started, I can't shoot on my own people. And when he left, we supported the Shah's last prime minister against Khomeini. We tried to undermine Khomeini. But when the hostages were taken, Carter made two fateful decisions. The first was at our first National Security Council meeting in the Situation Room. I argued, as did Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor, for blockading Karg Island, where 60% of the Iranian oil was exported, to show a really tough position. Carter was afraid that this would lead Khomeini to assassinate the hostages, and he didn't. And second, he said to the hostage families, my first priority is getting your loved ones back healthy as soon as possible. And that shifted leverage to Khomeini because he knew that Carter put such value in the hostages and their lives that he was not likely to take actions that would risk them. He negotiated for 444 days. The Nightline program for Ted Koppel started because of it. Walter Cronkite, the Dean of Reporting for CBS, and he apologized to Carter after the election for doing it. Every single news program he started for his nightly news, one was day 125, day 150, day 200, day 250 of the hostage crisis. And then Carter made another fateful decision against Rosalynn's advice, and that is he sequestered himself in the White House, canceled his foreign and domestic campaigning and his foreign meetings. Rosalynn ended up having to campaign against Kennedy to show he was spending full time on the hostages, but it elevated the issue to make it appear that everything else was secondary. Having said that, it was his negotiation, not Reagan's, that got the hostages out, and Khomeini, to rub salt into the wound, only released the hostages the second that Reagan was inaugurated, but pursuant to the agreement, and a very good agreement, that Jimmy Carter negotiated with Warren Christopher and with many others for the hostages, and we used many back channels for that.
Well, thank you for reminding us of that. So only a couple more questions. I wanted to, what does Jimmy Carter consider his greatest accomplishment of his presidency?
I think he considers the greatest accomplishment abroad being the Camp David Accords and the Egypt Treaty, bringing Israel its first peace agreement with its Arab enemies. And this has lasted to this very day, in which both Egypt and Israel and the United States oppose Hamas. Domestically, I think he feels that his most important accomplishments were bringing energy security to the United States. We're no longer dependent on OPEC. We have domestic production. We're now a net exporter of energy when we were a net importer, and it's because of the foundation of his three energy bills of deregulating natural gas and crude oil to increase production, conservation ethic, and beginning the renewable energy revolution with even putting a solar panel on the White House, and environment. He doubled the size. He was a great environmentalist, a great environmentalist. He forecast in his Global 2000 report the CO2 emission problems that we now know greenhouse, but he doubled the size, Nadine, of the national park system with his Alaska Lands Bill. And this shows how his attention to detail, as with Camp David, paid off. So let me give you one last anecdote. He brings Senator Ted Stevens, a conservative Republican from Alaska, senator from Alaska, to the Oval Office to try to sell the Alaska Lands Agreement, which would have set aside tens of millions of acres from oil and gas development. And he puts a giant map of Alaska on the Oval Office floor, and he literally gets down on his hands and knees to Senator Stevens, showing him every acre that was going to be preserved for oil and gas development, but all the ones that wouldn't, and why those should be preserved. And it sold Senator Stevens, and Senator Stevens told us after he left, he said, "I have been senator for 25 years of Alaska. I thought I knew Alaska like the back of my hand. Jimmy Carter knows my state better than I do." It was that attention to detail, for which he was often criticized, that led to some of his greatest accomplishments.
So Jimmy Carter has been an amazing past president. And I'm wondering, really, he's a model of how a president can accomplish so much, and just a role model since he left office. What is it that you think briefly made him such a popular post-president?
Well, thank you. And I'm going to go into that, but I want to say that I sort of rail against the notion because when people say, well, he was the greatest past president, the sort of subtext is he wasn't a good president, and he was a successful president. So having said that,
I think you've explained that in the last hour or so.
So having said that, let's go back to this landslide defeat. It was crushing. He was, Nadine, in his mid-50s. He was a young man. What does a man in his 50s who's been president of the United States do for a second act, for an encore? And it was very difficult to know. And he came up with Rosalynn with a brilliant idea. That is, he was not going to benefit financially from his presidency. He never took a nickel for a speech. He never took an honorarium. He never served on a corporate board. Think of how much he could have done. What he did was create a living, breathing presidential center, not just a museum, as all presidents have, but a set of model which President George W. Bush and President Clinton have followed, of an active, engaged presidential center following many of the issues he took as president. So, for example, the Carter Center, which now has over 150 employees and a very large endowment, has mediated disputes in Haiti, in Bosnia. It has solved 2 African diseases, guinea worm and river blindness, with partnering with some of the pharmaceutical companies. And he's monitored over 100 elections to see that they were full and democratic. And when he says they were or they weren't, it has a real impact. So the Carter Center is a living organism. It is a testament to his post-presidency and will for sure outlast him. It's not going to stop because Rosalynn has passed away and he has passed away. He has created a large endowment. He's got a great staff headed by Paige Alexander and experts in every one of these areas. The Carter Center is going to flourish. And just as his presidency was a legacy, and many of the things which he started only were recognized in his post-presidency for his successor, like, for example, the weapon systems for Reagan, the democratization. We haven't even talked about the Latin America, where he sent Rosalynn on a mission for human rights. He said, we're going to cut off arms unless you improve your human rights record. Thousands of political prisoners were released. The democracy movement we know in Latin America is his, but he followed it in his post-presidency. So there was this continuity of what he did as president and what he did as post-presidency, which really was unique and really a great testament.
I think most of us also just remember him for his work with Habitat for Humanity, for building homes, for all those. That's an incredible thing.
At Rosalynn's memorial service, I talked to the president of Habitat, and he said to me, and I'm quoting him exactly now, I want you to know, Stu Eizenstat, that Rosalynn and Jimmy Carter put us on the map. We were a small institution. We are now known worldwide, and they personally built 4,300 homes in 14 countries, including the United States, for low-income people.
So when you were at the funeral, did you see President Carter?
I did, but it was sad, really. He was a shadow of himself.
So you weren't
But
able to
the fact that he came, 3.5-hour drive from Plains, that he was willing to come in this condition and then have to go back to Plains, was a testament to how great their bond was, their love. It was his final goodbye, along with, of course, the funeral in Plains itself. And he just refused. His family did not want him to come. They were afraid it would weaken him for the funeral itself. But he insisted he had to come to show his last respects and to show the world what she had done as First Lady and what they had done together.
Thank you, Stu. This has been an absolutely amazing conversation. I am so grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about this.
Well, I'm really appreciative you gave me the chance.